Hello and welcome to the Scaling Playbook, Adapting Agile for Larger Endeavors. I'm Audrey Shearer with Lightspeed, and we are a group of trusted business agility advisors supporting lean and agile transformations worldwide. Our presenter today is Roland Cuellar, VP of Digital Transformation at Lightspeed. He is focused exclusively on agile software development and lean business process improvement for over a decade. He's supported enterprise agile adoption at Capital One, CNBC, Westinghouse Nuclear Power, Nationwide Insurance, USCIS, the US courts, and many, many others. Roland, take it away.
I'm the Vice President of our Digital Transformation Consulting practice here at Lightspeed. Focus a lot on organizational change and process design and working with leaders to get Agile up and running in their organizations. Really just focusing on using Agile to deliver big projects or programs involving many teams working together on some common effort. And over the years, we've worked on a number of these large sorts of programs, and some have been very successful, and others, not so much. I think they are extraordinarily challenging. These big programs, just in general, it's one of the hardest things there is probably to do on this planet, it seems, is to put out really large software endeavors, very high failure rates. In the cases where we have been successful, I think it's often been the case that these organizations tried waterfall once or even multiple times before and had big failures there, and then turned to Agile as another means of trying to deliver. And we see that pattern a lot. But even though, as I said, they've all been hard, they've all been messy, and it's just a real challenge, which leads one to consider whether there are alternatives to even doing big programs in the first place. I mean, one of the things that we would say is, people always ask, well, how do we do big projects in Agile? And one of the first things I would say is, well, let's try not to. There are architectural ways of getting around some of that sometimes by building a federation of smaller applications that perhaps share common data and other structures. So that you can turn huge efforts into lots of smaller ones that integrate with one another. And maybe there are some that are, have different challenges or successes and separate from each other. And I can get pieces of parts of this thing up and running with a little bit lower risk instead of the giant monolithic application approach. But let's just say that we have one of these big ones to deal with, and we're gonna focus on that today. This playbook represents some patterns that we feel, tend to work. And we'll discuss some anti-patterns as well. And of course, there's just no one way to do this. Some of you may disagree with some of our recommendations, or perhaps you tried something completely different and opposite, and that worked great. And that's great, I say. I say there are many paths to the top of the mountain. There's no one true way to get there. If there was a clear and consistent recipe for succeeding with large software endeavors, then the failure rate wouldn't be as high as it is. But let's go ahead and move on and get into some of the plays themselves. Okay, this is a big one. Learning to deliver less before trying to deliver more. It's a bit concerning. I see this pattern a lot, unfortunately. You've got budget, you've been approved to get started, and so we hire 10 Agile teams almost all at once to do some enormous Agile project. And we don't even have one team that knows how to do Agile really well yet. See this pattern quite a bit, and it's something definitely to be concerned about. What we would usually recommend is to just start with one team, maybe two that are even pretty small. And instead of scaling multiple teams, scale these teams. And by scaling these one or two teams, I mean getting them to the level of being high performing, teaching them how to pair and how to swarm and how to automate, how to successfully deliver and deliver with quality, teach them how to deploy, let them learn all that stuff. And once you have a one or maybe two teams that are really high performing, they know how to deliver repeatedly, then we start to take that model, whatever model is they're using, whatever tools and approaches that they've discovered, and we start to scale that model out by adding another team or two and growing in that way, so that we're working and scaling off a base of something that works. We've got teams that know how to do this stuff, and now we're taking that model and expanding it, as opposed to having 5 or 6 or 7 more teams all starting at once, and no one's figured out how to actually do this yet. once I get this one team that's really working well and they're rocking, and I start to add one or two other teams to that, we're going to have another level of learning that has to happen. Integration across teams is tough. So we don't want to load these teams up with a full plate of user stories, because if you do that, you're going to create a lot of WIP and a lot of technical debt and incur a lot of cost, and likely not to actually deliver all that much. We need to give these teams just a few stories each and let them learn how to integrate with each other, test with each other, build with each other, deploy with each other, and get through all of that. Now, at this point, I've got a small number of teams, 2 or 3 at the most, but they've really learned how to deliver individually, and they've learned how to deliver with each other. And now I think you're at the point where you can start to add some additional teams. So I would say the number one thing really is learn how to deliver less before you learn how to deliver more. Most folks are just way too aggressive here, and I've just never seen it work out well. They start out with way too many teams, and it's just chaos. Very expensive, a very expensive chaos, by the way. So that's it for this particular play. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. And this one is measuring incremental business value delivery. I think this is a really important one. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. We often start measuring the dev teams. We measure their velocities and their points and their planned versus delivered stories and all that kind of stuff. And that's fine. Those are important leading indicators, if you will, of our productivity and schedule performance, etc. The problem is that they're very dev team centric. They're really only focusing on the developers and the functional testers on the team. But in our experience, it takes a lot of different organizational silos in order to actually get something into production or even get it into a formal test environment of some kind. We need the infrastructure and environment people on board to have environments ready. We need the system testing people on board, such as end-to-end test or regression test or performance test or security test. They need to be on board with these more frequent deliveries. And deployment or configuration folks need to be on board with these more frequent deliveries. And focusing the metrics on the dev team, on the story points completed per sprint, doesn't put any real pressure on all of these other silos in the organization to change how they work. You know, how often do we hear that, you know, it takes security testing or performance testing or regression testing a month, you know, to do whatever it is that they need to do. Or the environments are just not going to be ready for months, for example. We need to measure up a level. We need to measure perhaps features actually delivered into some downstream system, or stories delivered into an integration test environment, or even better, into a production-like environment. When we measure up like that, that's going to put some pressure on all of these sister organizations to change how they do work to be able to support these frequent deliveries. I mean, of course, there are other reasons to measure up like this. I mean, being able to actually measure business results, real performance, getting real customer feedback, et cetera, those are all extraordinarily valuable. But before you can do that, you need to have, I think, some metrics that drive everyone towards some common goals that are pulling us all together and not only focused on really the dev teams. I think in our experience, if you don't actually measure deployments, you probably are very unlikely to actually get any. So this is an important one about having the right metrics in place that are going to make all of the various parts of the organization have to pull together. So I like to measure, the most important thing, measuring deployments. Okay, let's go ahead and move on then to the next play. And that's getting in front of these more complex stories. I want to be clear here that I'm not advocating having highly detailed spec level stories that lock the team into predetermined solutions. We definitely would not want that or recommend that. But one issue that organizations face when they're first starting to scale is it's probably not highly experienced yet in writing good stories either on the business side or the requirements side of the house. This is all could be new to them as well. And big systems often have really complex workflows and many kinds of persona, and sometimes they have really challenging operational requirements, and it's just complicated. And when first starting out on these large implementations, we often see stories that are still a bit too big, a bit too vague. They lack good acceptance criteria. They lack, test-driven development tests that are defined, and maybe they don't really hang together real well in terms of a workflow, et cetera.
and they just aren't really dev ready yet. Now, like I said, don't get me wrong, we don't want to encourage teams to, it's not that we don't want to encourage teams to come up with their own solutions or to overly constrain them with highly prescriptive, predetermined solutions. These wouldn't be good practices either, and we have to find this balance. But we do think it's a pretty good idea to have a good idea of what the desired outcomes are from an acceptance criteria, system behavior perspective. We want good, strong, tight user stories with good acceptance criteria that are clear about what the desired outcomes are. And the business side itself often lacks a real process for going from their wishes and desires into having good dev-ready stories. And this is something we often help customers implement. There's a lot of focus on the development side of the house in terms of Agile and Scrum and lots of good practices. But there's not as much out there in terms of support for the requirements development process in the business side. What is their process for creating a continuous flow of good dev-ready stories that that the teams can pick up and have a good chance of being able to successfully deliver? The business side of the house, often they need their own Agile-ish sort of process that is focused on creating these good, high-quality dev-ready stories, and it's a real challenge in most folks. We need to get out in front of this. There needs to be a pipeline, if you will, of requirements that flow into the teams, so that we've got time for the business side to gather the business rules that are relevant to this particular user story, or for the architects to uncover the dependencies and all of that kind of stuff that we may need to get out in front of a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the next one. And this is the finding the balance, kind of like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, not too hot, not too cold. The other pattern that we see is going overboard with all of this stuff. How do you know how much is right? Well, we often see, senior business folks who come up with big tasks such as features or epics or, what have you, and the business analysts then take it to the next level of detail and getting the business rules and whatnot in place. And then the systems analysts come in and turn these to detailed specs, and then someone tries to turn those into user stories and get those to the team, and the result can just be months of analysis and a lot of hours spent. And then we give all of this to the dev team, and one of several things can happen. One is they don't read any of it, and instead they just sort of say, hey, just tell me what you want this thing to do, because I'm not going to read all this stuff that you created. I see that behavior sometimes. Or they have a bunch of hard questions about the requirements that we didn't anticipate, and we don't have the answers to their real questions, even after months of analysis. The real problem here is that we're operating at a somewhat of an arm's length relationship with each other. Each silo or function is kind of doing their own thing and throwing it over to the next group, and we're interacting via paper handoffs. The business gives stuff to the requirements analysts. The requirements analysts put together a bunch of docs and send them over to the systems analysts, and systems analysts turn it on to somebody else, et cetera, and we have to sort of get out of that pattern. How do we, and so how do we deal with this exactly? And the answer, of course, is like a lot of Agile things, it's through conversation, face-to-face conversation with the teams. I would say during the upfront requirements process, when we're trying to pull together the next set of epics or stories or whatever that we want to have in our next set of sprints that are coming up soon, that we wanted to bring the tech leads, testing leads, the development teams, and architects into those discussions really early and ask them what real questions they have. Right? And they may come up with a whole bunch of questions that you may have not considered. And then you'll have things that you want them to know as well from a requirement standpoint. But now we can use this elaboration time to find out the real answers to their real questions. And working this way, you get the info to them that they actually need, and you don't spend a lot of time coming up with details around things that they don't actually have any questions about. You want to also be sure to bring the testers into this conversation. They'll often come up with a lot of real-life scenarios and variations that need to be taken into account. So conversation is really the key to finding the balance between too little elaboration and too much. We want to answer the real questions that people have, and not spend a lot of time going into deep analysis around things that people don't have questions about. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next one then. And so how do we do this, though? Where do these conversations happen? It sounds like it could be really inefficient. What's the structure by which these discussions happen? Well, we like this technique called big room planning, or if you are familiar with the SAFe model, the Scaled Agile Framework model, they would call it PI planning, but it's a very same kind of idea. And it's a really great technique. The idea is to bring everyone together, business leaders, architects, testers of various types, infrastructure people, dev teams, etc. And this could be a big meeting. I mean, this could be 100 people or more easily. But we're going to bring them all together and sort of create this environment where these discussions can happen in real time. It's really great. For example, I mean, the idea is sort of to create an open air marketplace where ideas and concerns and solutions can easily be discussed and traded with each other. In the SAFe model, for example, they would say to bring the whole team together about every quarter or so. And in this meeting, the leaders would lay out their goals for the quarter, and the teams would then break out into working sessions to plan out the next 4 or 5 sprints worth of work. Everyone involved gets to hear the goals and what the business is trying to achieve. Everyone works together on the plan right then and there. If there are dependencies that they uncover, they can just go to the other teams and work those out right there on the spot. The infrastructure and environment people know what's coming, and they may know that we need an additional test environment, so we need to open up connections to other systems where there are dependencies, or all manner of, maybe there are tools that need to be deployed. And all these discussions are happening in real time. And it's really just great. The plans that come out of this are usually pretty good. And we're building one team that's all working together on shared goals, and the teams are discovering the solutions and working with each other. It's really a great technique. It works really well, but it requires a fair bit of planning to pull it off well. And obviously it requires some adept facilitation to be able to work the big room, if you will, and herd all of these cats. But the big room planning technique is something we would definitely recommend, or PI planning if you just, interested or used more of the SAFe terminology. All right, let's go ahead and move on. This is a problem that we see sometimes, is getting sufficiently out in front of architecture and the UX, and getting these, you might hear in the Agile community, creating the architectural runway. And this is something that I think we all hear about, but not always sure how to actually do it or what it means. So I've seen a few large systems where they probably have made a couple of errors. One is they started off with too many teams, as I mentioned in our first play. And because I've got all these teams, I want to get them started on stuff. And so they start writing customer features too soon. And maybe they don't spend enough time building out the architecture, right? The result is that every team has its own solution to every technical problem sometimes. I've seen this a couple of times now. Each team does logging its own way, or they handle session management in slightly different ways, or they have different UI approaches, or each one is handling database interactions in their own kind of way. And this sometimes results from, as I said, starting off too many teams at once, trying to get to business functionality really quickly, which of course we all want to do, but we've got to find the right balance. And also some of the measurements, if we're going to once again focus on the user story points done, if that's what we're going to be measuring people on, then there's going to be a lot of pressure for them to start building stuff and getting credit for their points, and not focusing enough on the architecture and the quality. The first few sprints probably need to spend a fair bit of time figuring some of this architectural stuff out and other kinds of architectural concerns. If you don't do this, you're very likely to end up with a lot of inconsistencies in the way teams do stuff, and a lot of technical debt. And so how do you get out in front of it, though? And so the answer here, it's not with not with PowerPoint, even though we're showing PowerPoints right now, but architectural decisions, we want to make those architectural decisions real by actually building some working code that tests out these architectural decisions and see if they work, see if they perform, see how hard it is to actually code it or deploy it or configure it. So early sprints can still result in working tested software, but some of this software may be plumbing and architectural patterns. And once we get those up and running and we know it actually works, and once again, we can start to scale scale that out and we've got solutions to real problems, and we've verified and validated that they actually work. Right? We want to use our early sprints to do some of this work. Earlier, so that's one technique, and also another thing, you know, in the previous play we talked about big room planning. And one way to think about this is that when you do the big room planning technique or the PI planning, and we have our business leaders come in and lay out their goals for the quarter, the architects should have been highly involved in those discussions, working hand in hand with business along the way as they were trying to come up with their priorities and their sequence, as they determine what the next features are going to be for the next quarter or so, that the architects were in those meetings and discussions, and they're aware of what the business wants to do, and they've already had time to think about the architectural implications for the coming quarter, and perhaps even come up with some solutions to some of those issues. So that when we do the big room planning meeting, you know, business comes and says, here's what we want to do in the next quarter or so, and the architects can say, yes, and we've thought about that, and here's some things that we need to be aware of from a performance standpoint, a security standpoint, or configuration standpoint, or whatever it is. And now the dev teams have both the business picture and the technical picture, and they can move into doing the planning out their work. Right? So Audrey, if it's okay, I think right at this time, if we could do one of our poll questions. We had a poll question on what some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing out there. So I'll go ahead and let Audrey put that up there. The question here is, you know, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing? You know, requirements, quality, and readiness. You know, development productivity and quality. Just getting through gate reviews and PMOs. Maybe it's getting through system testing or regression testing or performance testing or security or just environments and infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So go ahead and let's answer those questions. And while you're doing that, I think we can go ahead and move forward with some of the next plays.
All right, looks like we're about at 75% voted, so I think we'll just close it. Check out the answers here.
All righty.
Here we are.
Interesting. Okay. And I'm not surprised at this at all. As I mentioned, you know, the big vote getter here is really the requirements, quality, and readiness, and then the development, productivity, and quality. These things go hand in hand. As I said, there's a lot of support out there, a lot of books, tools, techniques, training, et cetera, for the development side of the house and how to do Agile. But in our experience, the whole upfront requirements process, especially on these big programs, is really under supported. We've been doing a lot of this work lately with some of our Fortune 500, several Fortune 500 clients, really to shore up an Agile requirements process that creates this continuous flow of good dev-ready stories. This is well outside of, you know, the individual Agile development teams themselves, and kind of working more with and the business and the folks that sit sometimes in between the business and the dev teams from an analysis standpoint. So, all right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next one, and this is integrating early and often. You know, I think a lot of us, we've all heard over the years, you know, when we have issues with a particular piece of code, you know, hey, it well worked on my machine, right? And then when you start to scale up to multiple teams, you can expect to hear something slightly different, but kind of the same. Hey, it worked in our team, right? Integration is tough, and bringing the code from multiple teams together and getting it to build and getting it to deploy and getting it to run just can be a real challenge. And unfortunately, it's not always the team's main focus, especially if they're being measured on, you know, just their points per sprint or something like that. Those kind of measurements just beg for the teams to get it to work in their own environment so they can claim that they're done with their points. And sometimes it's not always clear, you know, who's on the hook to pull it all together and get it all to build and run as a complete system. Some folks have the budget and the luxury of having a system team that tries to help with some of these issues, or a build team or something like that. And other places, the development teams need to do it themselves. Either way, it's a real challenge, and you're going to need to do it really early and really often. Until you can integrate, you can't really know where you are at the product or at the system level. And in the end, that's all that really matters is, do we have a system that pulls all the code together from all the teams, and I can run it and test it, and I know what's working and not working. And so that, once again, this is one of these situations where having those higher level metrics, perhaps measuring around, features delivered into the integration environment, or stories delivered successfully into the integration environment, or some formal test environment, or even production, are really helpful because it forces pull everyone together, as I said, towards those common goals. You can lose a lot of time with this kind of stuff. You can't. I want to caution folks against loading up their teams with, to capacity with a bunch of stories, and not having any time there for them to deal with all of the issues that are going to come up when we try to integrate. When we try to integrate, we're going to have build issues, we're going to have configuration issues, we're going to have deployment issues, we're going to just have stuff that doesn't work. And that isn't easily captured in any one particular story, if you will, in your backlog. So we need to have some capacity in our teams to deal with all of these things that come up. Because like I said, if it doesn't actually work in integration, you got nothing. And so we want to integrate early and often, and we need to give the teams the space to deal with that. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next play then. And this is around making the supporting teams equally accountable, and I'll talk about what I mean by the supporting teams. Over and over, we've seen the whole Agile thing being treated as a software development, kind of thing. That really Agile is sometimes in a lot of organizations really just treated in a very software development centric kind of view. And then you start poking around and you talk to other people, and they say in the organization, they say, hey, our security office doesn't do it that way. Right? We want to do one security scan, and we're going to do it near the end, and we need a month to do that, right? Or the performance testing team doesn't work that way, or the architecture team doesn't work this way, or the gate review process doesn't work this way, and on and on and on, of all the different pieces and parts and silos in the organization. And very important to recognize, you're just not going to be successful with Agile delivery in this kind of situation. We often need to work with pretty senior level executives and get them to use their influence to get the entire organization to support Agile delivery. It's definitely not just a software development thing. All of these groups and many others need to have some skin in the game for making the changes necessary in their processes to enable a more Agile organization. In lean process improvement, we usually focus on addressing bottlenecks. And if the bottleneck is security scans or regression testing or performance testing or gate reviews or deployment, whatever those are, and all of those things sit outside of the individual development team sometimes, then that's where we need to put our process improvement focus on. All of these functions need to have shared objectives in terms of enabling value delivery. And in many organizations, they just don't. And so very important to take a systematic and systemic organization and value stream view of Agile. Everyone's got to play a part in this, or it's just really not going to work. Okay, let's go and talk about the next play, and that's getting out in front of this system testing. The testing that happens at the team level, such as the unit testing and the functional testing, for example, they're challenging enough, but they're reasonably manageable. But things often start to get a little hairy when we start talking about end-to-end testing, system testing, performance testing, regression testing, all that kind of stuff. These are functions that really need to be able, in an Agile world, need to be able to run all the time, repeatedly, and they need to be pretty quick, actually, if they're going to keep up. And this is a huge change for most testing organizations. In a traditional world, they might be used to having to do this only once in a waterfall program near the end, and perhaps having weeks or months even sometimes to do that. And it's just not going to fly in the Agile delivery model that we're trying to get to. These activities really are going to demand some serious automation. And that is almost always a pretty daunting task. This is really way too complicated a topic to get into a lot of detail here, but we really need to think about these system testing strategies, testing hierarchies. How do you stub out or mock out interfaces to external systems? looking at test performance in a big kind of way. If it takes a long time for the test to run, they're just never going to be able to keep up. The net here, though, is that testing needs to be treated as a first-class citizen here and not a back-end afterthought function. We need a real testing strategy. It needs budget, it needs resources, and it needs time to sufficiently devote to this extraordinarily complex topic. You know, like architecture, if we don't get out in front of it, it's going to become a big bottleneck in our experience. And I think, once again, we tend to have a very dev-centric view of this whole Agile thing. And I think that a lot of the system-level testing just doesn't nearly get the attention that it deserves in order to enable frequent testing and frequent delivery. All right, let's talk about another one. And this is another one of these places where we've got to do find the balance, and that is, you know, how much do we standardize and how much do we innovate and all that kind of thing. We're big fans here of giving teams and people as much autonomy as they can take. That is definitely how we like to operate. But on these larger programs, we got to find some balance. You know, a bunch of teams, everybody kind of doing everything their own way, it usually ends up with a lot of what I'll call local efficiency. It's efficient for this particular team, and it helps them solve their problem, and that's great. I mean, we want teams to be able to solve their problems. But sometimes it can lead to being inefficient at the program level, especially for the integrators or the deployers or the configuration management people or the testing people. You know, in the DevOps world, there's a saying that we should, you know, ruthlessly standardize machines and environments and tools, and that they should be treated as cattle, not as individual, unique little pets, and everyone kind of taking care of their own little snowflake environment, etc. And it's through this ruthless standardization of that kind of stuff, infrastructure stuff, that we can get to automation and automated deployments and automated builds and automated testing. And all of that automation is not only going to give us some speed, but it's going to give us higher quality too. So, you know, that said, you know, who decides what level of standardization and innovation that we should have? You know, how do we know what to standardize and who would do that? And this is where the innovation piece comes into play, I think. As teams grapple with problems, and some teams will come up with simple and elegant solutions to those problems, all around all manner of issues, coding practices or security or performance or builds or deployments or what have you. And as teams discover good solutions to those problems that actually work for them on the ground, they need to share those practices with other teams. And in this way, we get both innovation and standardization. We don't have someone from up high, you know, telling everybody kind of how to do this stuff, especially when those people aren't the ones on the hook to make it work on a day-to-day basis. These decisions are coming from the folks who are closest to the problems and are probably in the best position to figure out efficient, effective ways that to get these problems solved or get these things done. And then what we want to do is to have those practices that have been proven and that work spread to other teams, so that the teams are doing things in standardized ways, but the ways that they're doing actually work on the ground for them. Some of that, you know, notions of things like guilds and tribes and chapters and all that kind of Spotify stuff can be a great way of facilitating and growing the use of these standardized approaches while letting the innovation happen on the ground in a very, very dynamic kind of way. All right, let's talk about another one then. And this is an interesting one, and I don't think it gets nearly enough attention. We talk a lot, this notion of making management's work visible. We talk a lot in the Agile community about visibility and transparency and all that kind of stuff. And it's usually focused on the delivery teams. You know, what's in your backlog, what's in your WIP, let's look at your burn down charts, let's look at your defects, and just a microscope, you know, sometimes on the development teams. And I don't see as much of a microscope on some other things that are maybe perhaps even more important. In our experience, a lot of what impedes delivery on large projects is stuff that's outside of the team's ability to control, right? They can't get environments, they can't get answers to questions, they can't get decisions, they can't get through security reviews, they can't get through gate reviews, they can't get through this, they can't get through something else. And these are often things that the teams have maybe some influence over, but they don't own it. And maybe their ability to change it is, in some organizations, maybe they have it. In many organizations, they don't. In the servant leadership model that most of us in the Agile community espouse, dealing with these kinds of issues then becomes the work of leadership. The leadership works for the team, tries to blow through some of these issues or solve some of these problems that they're having, and leadership is working to help the teams get through these barriers, right? And so I'd like to see that management's work is made visible too. It needs to be shown, it needs to be tracked, it needs focus, and all those things. I'd like to see a Kanban board for the stuff that the leaders need to do. It deserves at least as much attention as the individual teams, if not more. It's a big deal, and one can imagine a Kanban board of decisions that need to be made, environments that need to be procured, tools that need to be procured, policies or rules, internal practices that need to be changed, and we can manage those in Agile kinds of ways as well for the management team. It's the problems that they need to solve. It's a really big issue in a lot of places, and it just doesn't get the focus that it should, in my opinion. All right, I want to have another little poll question here, Audrey, our second one of the day, when you're ready. Here's the next one. It's really important, and it goes into the next set of topics, basically. How many high-performing teams have you ever been a part of? And by that, I mean, you did hard work. It was challenging. You struggled with it, but you got a lot of great things done, and you had fun doing it. And yeah, maybe you had to work some nights, maybe you had to work some weekends, but you guys were just gelling as a team. Like, you guys were on fire. The chemistry was there. It was hard, but you actually enjoyed it, and you look back fondly on that project, and you wish that others were like that. And I just wonder how many people have felt like they've been a part of a really rockin' high-performing team, and how many times that's ever happened to you.
All right, a couple of seconds, and we're going to hit 75% here.
Awesome. Thank you for your participation.
All right, poll is closed.
Oh, this is good. This is great. There's a few people that have had this happen with them multiple times, and that is just wonderful. The sadder thing is on the top. You start to get to 30, 40, 50% of the folks have only ever experienced this once or twice in their careers, and that's kind of actually even where I am. I've only been on it, I think, maybe 2 or so big programs or projects where I had this feeling that we were really on fire, like we were just killing it, and we were having a great time, and we were learning a lot. And it's something that doesn't happen enough. And to me, it's sort of management's #1 job, is how do I create this high-performing team? How do I make this an enjoyable, positive place to work? So let's go ahead and then get into the next topic, and that would be making people, your #1 job. There's a great movement going on in the Agile community called Modern Agile, and I would encourage you to look at it. You just go to Google or whatever and look up Modern Agile. You'll find stuff about it. But the basic idea is to help make people great. It's a very people-centric approach to Agile, and this is important because at the end of the day, you're only going to be successful really not because of your tools or because of your plan or because of your estimates or any of that kind of stuff, but it's because you had really caring, committed, enthusiastic people who put in the work to get the job done. And the people part of this is probably the most important part. Not probably the most part, it is the most important part. And many of us who have a technical background, myself included, often forget this. Our leaders set the tone for the organization. Is it going to be a sweatshop? Is it a field of landmines? Or people, it's safe to try out new things, to experiment, to discover what works, and to learn. Is this the kind of place that if you make a mistake, you're going to be out of there? Or is it an environment that is sort of nurturing and exciting and growing, and it's a great place to work? That doesn't mean that it's a vacation, that it's easy, but we're doing hard stuff, but we're having a good time doing it. You know, I often ask people how many times they've had a chance to work on really high-performing teams, that we just talked about, and you know, sadly, a great number of people have only ever experienced it once or twice. And this is what I feel should be management's primary goal, is to make this office somewhere where people want to be. And if they want to be there and they're excited about what they're doing, that's where the magic happens. The magic isn't going to come through the planning or the estimates or the tools or the processes. It's going to come from people who are just on fire. And it's a hard thing to pull off. It requires a lot of attention, and I think it gets shortchanged a lot. No easy answers on how to do that. A lot of resources and books and all manner of things on how to go about that. But the real problem, I think, is just doesn't get the focus that it needs. I think it needs to be much higher on the list of to-do things than a lot of the other things that we put up there. Okay, somewhat related to that is the learning piece. And I don't think that folks understand when we talk about learning in an Agile organization what we really mean, because you hear a lot about it, the learning organization and all this kind of stuff, right? But I don't think that people are quite grasping it at the right level. I don't mean book learning or taking classes or getting certified. You know, those are all fine and they're all necessary, but they're nowhere near sufficient, okay? Here's what I mean. You can read all the books you want to about swimming. You're not going to know how to swim until you just jump in the water and probably choke a few times, right? Same with skiing. You know, you can read all you want about skiing. You can watch videos. You can go to, you know, watch people do it, etc. But you're not going to know how to ski until you just go out there and fall on your butt a couple of thousand times, right? Folks, this Agile stuff it's not so much about knowing, but about doing. And it takes time to learn how to actually do this stuff. And it doesn't just go for developers, right? Testers need to learn how to test at more granular levels and test more frequently, and how to work more in parallel with development as opposed to being in the back of it. Business folks need to learn how to, you know, what to build and in what order to build it. And it's very new for them, because in the waterfall world, we just ask for it all. But in the Agile world, you got to make really hard decisions about the sequencing of value. It requires a lot of learning from everyone, and one of the big things that we see is there just isn't enough space for learning. You know, we'll hire up 10 teams and we'll load them to full capacity with a bunch of stories, and we'll expect 10x productivity and delivery, and it just doesn't work that way. At least in my experience, I've never seen that. Or perhaps it does in one sense. If you don't even have one team that's learned how to reliably deliver and their velocity is 0, then you will get 10x return. You're going to get 10 times 0, which is just 0 and a lot of chaos. Our advice is really to start slowly, as I mentioned before, get one or two teams going, and give them that time and space to really learn how to do this stuff well, and then start to scale it up and add some more teams who can learn from the teams that have learned how to do it. You can start to add more automation, add more swarming, etc. And now you're really going now at this point. So we've learned how to do this stuff, and then we can scale that and teach others and so forth. And soon enough, you have lots of teams that are really good, and the productivity will come then. But you know, if you don't let the learning happen, it's just not going to get there. It's just really important, especially if this is your first, you know, really big Agile program. You're just learning how to do this stuff. Okay, let's go ahead. Synchronization. This is an important topic. And by synchronization, I mean bringing us all together. It's expected that each team is going to get their stories. You know, each team is sort of expecting to get their handful of user stories, and then off they go. They're going to be focusing on getting their stories done, right? And this will naturally tend to send everyone off in slightly different directions as they pursue their local goals, all to be expected, normal human behavior. But we need to pull everyone back together frequently to make sure that we're all working together towards common goals, and that we're helping each other out and not just pursuing our own points, if you will. We may need Scrum of Scrums by the Scrum Masters, Scrum of Scrums by the product owners, Scrum of Scrums by the architects and tech leads and test leads, all these sort of, these sorts of things pull diverse information in from the teams that can help to disseminate that information back out again. And other means of synchronization are frequent integrations, as we talked about earlier, frequent demos of the entire system, not just individual team demos, but demoing the whole system. Program level retrospectives, these big room planning events we talked about earlier are another form of synchronization. The goal here is that our leaders are bringing everyone together, right, on a frequent basis, getting them to work together, to share with each other, to help each other, and not just pursuing their local success and local efficiencies and getting their own points done. And so someone needs to be making this synchronization happen. All right. So those are really the plays, if you will. And I want to kind of close out here in the next few minutes with some other things that we need to talk about, just the whole approach to Agile. I want to talk a little bit about the business agility thing. So let's go ahead and move on. One of the things that I just want to leave you with a set of ideas. It's not uncommon, for us to see highly detailed, really baked in roadmaps and highly detailed estimates and fixed scopes and fixed plans and fixed everything, and then trying to use Agile teams to deliver this this very fixed mindset scope of work. It's pretty common, I think. And guess what? In my mind, there's just nothing Agile about that. That whole paradigm. There's no flexibility there in what we deliver. There's no flexibility in when we deliver it. And I think that working this way just kind of misses the whole point entirely. The world just isn't going to wait for us to deliver on our 2-year delivery plan. Customer priorities are going to change. Competitors are going to launch new stuff. Regulations are going to change. New opportunities are going to arise. And we just need a much more dynamic system for managing all of this. And so what we like to talk about really is, and it's something that's really gaining a lot of traction out there. We're just seeing a lot of it in our consulting business right now, this notion of business agility. And by that, we mean shifting left, shifting up, and shifting right. Shifting left means getting more agile about what we build and when we build it and how we respond to new information, and getting away from plans that sort of lock us into a predetermined destination. It's about how do we create options for ourselves, and how do we create options for our customers and for our business, right? Shifting up is about putting the portfolio management pieces in place, and the strategy and the budgeting processes in place to support this kind of responsiveness, to support this kind of creating these options for ourselves that I just talked about. Jack Welch, back in his days at the helm of GE, said, if the outside world is moving faster than the inside world of your organization, then the end is in sight. And so for us to really create an agile organization, we need to address some of these issues like strategy, like budgeting, like resource management, and like portfolio management. And as I said, we're just seeing a big focus on this right now, getting a lot of calls about this topic from a lot of big companies. And shifting right is this notion of automation, and it's getting real data throughout the whole pipeline, and getting real data back from production in a much more dynamic kind of way, so that we can dynamically measure and react and adjust and manage all of this. And so if we go on then to the next slide, and then we'll be just about ready to close it out. This is sort of our diagram, if you will, that just kind of shows some of the elements of really an agile business, and how this would all fit together. You see things here, for instance, on the left-hand side, like MVPs, minimum viable products, hypotheses and experiments, getting data, and using that data as we go around to the top to drive into a more emergent, dynamic strategy that informs, frequent deployments. If we're going to have frequent deployments, I need this continuous quality and testing. And all of this stuff working together in a virtuous cycle that creates a dynamic organization. It's a beautiful and exciting topic, and as I said, one that's just rapidly growing, and probably one that we'll be exploring in another webinar soon. But that's really all that I had to say on the scaling topic today. I'm going to turn it back over to Audrey and let her close us out.
Thanks, Roland. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We will stick around for a few questions, so you can stick those in the chat box, bottom right. You can also download our scaling playbook in the handouts section, bottom right. We'll send a recording of this webinar later on today. And a few events to keep on your radar. Catch Roland at the Agile Leadership Academy in Herndon, Virginia, September 10th and 11th. And then we also host the Agile DC Executive Summit coming up September 12th in Fairfax. If you'd like any more info about those events, or you have other questions you'd like to send to Roland, send them to training@lightspeed.com. And let's check on any questions in the box here. Yes, you will gain SEUs for joining the session, and you'll get info about that in an email right after this ends. All right, Roland, we'll give it a couple minutes for questions.
Okie dokie.
And thanks everyone for joining us. Looks like not a lot coming in except for a thank you, Mark. And we'll see you all in any questions, and have a great day. All right, thanks, Roland.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.